Sarah had always been a bargain hunter. Every Saturday morning, she'd map out garage sales and estate sales across town, hunting for hidden treasures among other people's discarded memories. It was therapeutic, she told herself, a way to find unique pieces for her apartment while staying within her graduate student budget. The Hendricks estate sale was her last stop that particular October morning. The elderly woman who'd lived there had passed away 3 months prior, and her children were clearing out decades of accumulated belongings. The house felt heavy with the weight of a long life lived, every room filled with the melancholy of abandonment. Sarah browsed through china sets and vintage clothing, finding nothing that called to her. She was about to leave when she spotted a cardboard box tucked beneath a folding table in the garage. A handwritten sign read, "Books, $1 each." Most were romance novels and outdated self-help guides, but at the bottom of the box, her fingers found something different. The book was bound in deep red leather that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. No title graced the cover, just an embossed image of a grinning face with exaggerated features, wide eyes, a too large smile, and a pointed hat that suggested a jester or clown. The leather was soft and supple, as if the book had been made yesterday rather than decades ago. When Sarah opened it, the pages were thick parchment that crackled with age. The title page read simply, "Grimaldi's Greatest Performance," in ornate Gothic lettering. "Find something interesting?" asked Mrs. Hendrick's daughter, appearing suddenly at Sarah's shoulder. "Just this old book," Sarah replied, closing it quickly. Something about the woman's expression had changed when she saw what Sarah was holding. "Oh, that," the woman's voice carried a note of distaste. "My mother bought that at an auction years ago. She never read it, just kept it locked in her bedroom closet. Always said it gave her the creeps." "I'll take it," Sarah said, fishing $1 from her purse. The woman accepted the money with obvious relief. "Good riddance," she muttered as Sarah walked away. That evening, Sarah settled into her favorite reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea and opened her unusual purchase. The first page contained a dedication written in faded ink. "To those who understand that laughter and screams are separated by the thinnest of veils." The story began innocuously enough. Set in 1920s Paris, it followed the career of Grimaldi, a circus performer known for his elaborate makeup and increasingly disturbing acts. The writing was elegant, almost hypnotic, drawing Sarah deeper into a world where entertainment and horror blurred together. As she read, Sarah began to notice something odd. The descriptions of Grimaldi's appearance were unusually vivid, so detailed she could picture him perfectly in her mind. Red nose like a drop of fresh blood, white face paint cracked around deep-set eyes, a smile painted far too wide, extending beyond the natural corners of his mouth, and his laugh, described with such precision that Sarah could almost hear it echoing in her quiet apartment. By the 3rd chapter, she was thoroughly engrossed. Grimaldi had begun targeting specific audience members during his performances, singling them out for increasingly personal and cruel jokes. The author described each victim's growing terror with disturbing relish, noting how their fear seemed to energize the performer, making his makeup more vivid, his movements more fluid, his presence more commanding. Sarah glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. She should go to bed, but the story had hooked her completely. Just one more chapter. That's when she heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it. Soft laughter, barely audible above the hum of her refrigerator. Sarah paused in her reading, listening carefully. Probably just the upstairs neighbors watching late-night television. She returned to the book, but now the words seemed to shimmer slightly on the page, as if the ink were still wet. The chapter described Grimaldi's most infamous performance, where he had somehow convinced an entire audience that his victim's terror was part of the act. Even as people screamed in genuine fear, the crowd applauded, believing it was elaborate theater. The laughter came again, closer this time. Definitely not from upstairs. Sarah set down the book and listened intently. Her apartment was on the ground floor of an old building, surrounded by thick walls that usually blocked out most noise. But this sound seemed to come from inside her own space, though she couldn't pinpoint the location. When she picked up the book again, her hands were trembling slightly. The text now described how Grimaldi fed on fear itself, how fear made him more substantial, more real. According to the story, he existed in the space between imagination and reality, sustained by the very emotion he created in others. The more afraid his audience became, the more present Grimaldi became in their world. Fear was his doorway, terror his invitation. Sarah's tea had gone cold, but she barely noticed. The apartment felt different now, larger somehow, with shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and continued reading. The next chapter made her stomach clench with unease. It described Grimaldi's ability to step out of stories, to manifest in the real world when someone was reading about him with sufficient fear. The author wrote with clinical detachment about how Grimaldi would first appear as shadows in peripheral vision, then as faint reflections, and finally as a physical presence. The reader's fear acts as a beacon, calling him across the void between fiction and reality. And once summoned, Grimaldi always completes his performance. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside Sarah's apartment. She froze, book still open in her lap. Old buildings settle, she told herself. Pipes expand and contract. Wood shifts with temperature changes. But the sound had been too deliberate, too rhythmic, like footsteps. Sarah closed the book and set it on the coffee table, but her eyes were drawn back to the cover. In the lamplight, the embossed clown face seemed to be grinning wider than before. The pointed hat cast a shadow that hadn't been there earlier. She stood up and walked to the front door, checking the deadbolt and security chain.
Both were secure. She peered through the peephole into the empty hallway, lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. When she turned back to her chair, the book was open again. Sarah's heart began to race. She was certain she'd closed it. The pages were turned to a chapter she hadn't reached yet, titled The Final Curtain. But she hadn't touched the book. She'd been at the door for less than 30 seconds.
She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But when the operator answered, all that came through the speaker was more laughter, the same voice, the same horrible joy. 911, what's your emergency? The voice said. But it was wrong. The words were right, but the tone was mocking, playful. Are you having a little fear tonight, Sarah? A little terror to spice up your evening reading? Sarah hung up and ran toward her bedroom, but stopped dead in the doorway. Her reflection in the dresser mirror showed her standing alone, terrified and shaking. But behind her reflection, barely visible in the glass, was another figure. Tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned jester's outfit in garish colors. White face paint cracked with age, revealing glimpses of something darker underneath. Red nose that pulsed like a heartbeat, and that smile, painted far beyond the natural boundaries of any human mouth, stretching from ear to ear in a rictus of eternal amusement. Sarah didn't turn around. She couldn't. Instead, she watched in the mirror as Grimaldi raised one gloved hand and waved at her reflection with exaggerated friendliness. Don't be rude, Sarah. His voice came from right behind her ear, though the mirror showed he was still several feet away. I've come such a long way to meet you. The least you could do is turn around and give me a proper hello. You're not real, Sarah whispered to the mirror. You're just a story, just words on a page. Grimaldi's reflection tilted its head with theatrical confusion. But Sarah, you made me real. Every time your heart raced while reading about me. Every time you imagined my face in vivid detail. Every moment you spent afraid. You were feeding me, calling me, inviting me into your world. In the mirror, he took a step closer. And now the performance can truly begin. Sarah finally turned around, but the space behind her was empty. No clown, no intruder, just her familiar bedroom with its unmade bed and scattered textbooks. But when she looked back at the mirror, Grimaldi was still there, now standing exactly where she had been. Fear is such a wonderful thing, his reflection continued, pulling out a set of juggling balls that dripped with something dark. It opens doorways, breaks down the barriers between what is and what could be. And you, my dear Sarah, have been absolutely terrified. She was. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands shook uncontrollably and cold sweat beaded on her forehead. The fear was consuming her, making her dizzy and weak. But with the weakness came a realization. The book had explained Grimaldi's power source. He fed on fear, grew stronger from terror, became more real through the audience's emotional response.
which meant... Sarah forced herself to take a deep breath, then another. She looked directly at Grimaldi's reflection and began to laugh. Not hysterical laughter born of fear, but genuine amusement. Because when she really looked at him, this painted creature juggling in her mirror, he was absolutely ridiculous. A grown man in a silly costume, desperate for attention, feeding off other people's emotions like a psychic vampire. "You know what?" Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "You're not scary. You're pathetic."
Grimaldi's reflection faltered mid-juggle. "What?" "I said you're pathetic. A creature that can only exist by making other people afraid. That's not power. That's parasitism. You're like a tick that feeds on emotions instead of blood." The clown's painted smile began to waver. "You don't understand. I am the stuff of nightmares. You're a has-been performer from a century-old book that nobody else even wanted to read," Sarah interrupted, feeling her confidence return. "The only reason you can manifest at all is because I was sitting alone in a dark apartment, psyching myself out over a silly story." She walked to her bedside lamp and flipped it on, flooding the room with warm light. Grimaldi's reflection grew fainter. "And now I'm not afraid anymore," she continued, moving through the apartment and turning on every light switch she could find. "I'm annoyed that some fictional character interrupted my evening. Annoyed that I fell for such an obvious psychological trick. And mostly annoyed that I wasted $1 on a book designed to mess with people's heads." With each light that came on, Grimaldi's presence diminished. His reflection in the mirror became translucent, his voice fainter. "This isn't how the story ends," he protested weakly. "I always get the last laugh." "Not this time," Sarah said firmly. She marched back to the living room, picked up the red leather book, and walked straight to her kitchen. She turned on the gas stove and held the book over the blue flame. "Wait!" Grimaldi's voice was barely a whisper now. "You can't destroy me. I'm part of you now, part of your memory." "Watch me," Sarah replied, and dropped the book into her sink. The leather caught fire immediately, burning with an unnatural blue flame that smelled of sulfur and burnt cotton candy. Within minutes, nothing remained but ash. The apartment fell silent, except for the normal sounds of urban life. Distant traffic, the building's heating system, her neighbor's television playing some late-night talk show. Sarah returned to her bedroom and looked in the mirror. Only her own reflection stared back, tired but triumphant. She slept peacefully that night, and every night since, because she'd learned something important about fear. It only has as much power as you give it. And sometimes, the best way to defeat a monster is to refuse to be afraid of it. The story could have ended there, should have ended there. But 3 weeks later, Sarah was browsing another garage sale when she overheard two women talking by a box of children's books. "I don't know why anyone would write something so disturbing," one was saying. "It's about this clown character who supposedly comes to life when you read about him. Absolute nonsense, but it gave me nightmares for weeks." "Where did you get it?" the other woman asked. "Some estate sale. The strangest thing, though, when I tried to throw it away, it kept reappearing on my nightstand. I finally had to burn it to get rid of it." Sarah's blood ran cold. She approached the women casually. "Excuse me, but what was the title of that book?" "Oh, something about Grimaldi. Grimaldi's greatest performance, I think. Bound in red leather with this awful clown face on the cover." Sarah slept peacefully that night, convinced she had defeated the supernatural threat through sheer force of will and rational thinking. For 2 weeks, life returned to normal. She attended her graduate classes, worked on her thesis, and even returned to browsing garage sales on Saturday mornings. The red leather book became nothing more than an interesting story she occasionally shared with friends. A cautionary tale about the power of suggestion and the dangers of reading alone in dark apartments. But Grimaldi wasn't finished with her. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening as Sarah walked home from the campus library. She was cutting through the downtown shopping district when she glimpsed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. In the reflection of a storefront window, she saw him. Grimaldi stood across the street, partially hidden in the shadows between two buildings. Even at that distance, his white face paint gleamed under the street lights like a beacon. He wasn't moving, wasn't performing, wasn't doing anything theatrical. He was simply watching her with those painted eyes, his too wide smile never wavering. Sarah spun around to look directly across the street, but the space between the buildings was empty. Just shadows and brick walls and the distant hum of traffic. When she looked back at the window reflection, he was gone. She told herself it was stress, graduate school pressure, too much caffeine and too little sleep creating visual hallucinations, the mind playing tricks, conjuring fears from recent memory. But deep down, she knew better. Over the next few days, the sightings became more frequent. A flash of red and white in her peripheral vision as she rode the bus. A tall, thin figure disappearing around corners just as she turned to look. The faint sound of carnival music drifting through her apartment walls at night, always stopping the moment she tried to locate its source. Sarah began to research again, diving deeper into the book's history than she had before. What she discovered made her stomach turn with a cold, creeping dread. The book had been appearing at estate sales and garage sales for over 60 years. Always the same red leather binding, always the same embossed clown face, always sold for exactly $1. But the pattern wasn't what she had initially thought. People didn't disappear immediately after reading the book. They lived normal lives for weeks, sometimes months afterward, believing they had conquered their fears and moved on. They would tell friends about their experience, laughing about how they had defeated a fictional monster through logic and courage. And then, when their guard was completely down, when they felt safe and rational and proud of their victory, Grimaldi would return. This time, he wouldn't need their fear to manifest. He would have spent weeks feeding on their confidence, their smugness, their certainty that they had won. And when he finally revealed himself again, the shock and terror of realizing they had never been safe at all would give him more power than their initial fear ever could. The disappearances always happened exactly 3 weeks after the book was burned. Sarah counted the days. It had been 18 days since she had destroyed the book. 5 days left. That night, she didn't even try to sleep. She sat in her living room with every light blazing, a baseball bat across her knees, her phone charged and ready to call for help. She had researched protection spells, bought sage to burn, even considered checking into a hotel under a false name. But she knew it wouldn't matter. Grimaldi wasn't bound by normal rules of space and time. He existed in the gaps between fear and relief, in the moment when confidence turned to terror. As the clock struck midnight, marking the 19th day, Sarah heard the laughter. It started softly, barely audible above the building's ambient noise, but it grew steadily louder, more present, more real. This wasn't coming from her imagination or from some distant television. This was coming from directly outside her apartment. Sarah went to the window and looked down into the street below. Grimaldi stood under the same streetlight where she had first seen him weeks ago. But he was different now, more solid, more detailed, more absolutely real than he had been during their first encounter. His costume was pristine, his makeup perfect, his presence undeniable. He looked up at her window and tipped his pointed hat in a mocking salute. Then he began to climb. Not the fire escape, not the exterior stairs, but the air itself. He ascended with impossible grace, his long fingers finding purchase on invisible handholds, his feet stepping on nothing, but somehow supporting his weight. With each upward movement, he became more present, more substantial, more terrifyingly real. Sarah backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her phone showed no signal. Not even emergency calls would go through. A soft tap came at the glass, polite, patient, almost friendly.
"Hello again, Sarah," came Grimaldi's voice, muffled but clear through the window. "I told you this wasn't how the story ends. Did you really think burning my book would be enough? Did you really believe you could defeat me with indifference?" Sarah pressed herself against the far wall, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but watch as Grimaldi somehow passed through the glass without breaking it, materializing in her living room like smoke becoming solid. He was enormous up close, at least 7 feet tall, with limbs that stretched beyond human proportions. His makeup wasn't paint anymore, but something deeper, something that had become part of his skin. The smile carved across his face was no longer an exaggeration, but his actual mouth, split wider than any human mouth should go. "You see," Grimaldi continued conversationally, brushing imaginary dust from his colorful costume, "fear was never my only food source. Fear was just the appetizer. The main course, the real sustenance I crave, is the moment when someone realizes their victory was an illusion. The instant when confidence crumbles into absolute terror." He turned to face Sarah fully, and she saw that his eyes were completely black, not painted black, but actual voids in his skull. "And you, my dear Sarah, have been marinating in that delicious confidence for almost 3 weeks now. You've been telling people how you defeated the monster, how you overcame your fear, how you proved that evil can't triumph over rational thinking." Grimaldi began to laugh, and the sound filled the apartment like breaking glass. "But you never defeated me at all. You just gave me time to get hungry, time to get ready for the real performance." Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She tried to scream, but no sound came from her throat. She could only stand there, paralyzed by a terror more absolute than anything she had felt while reading the book. Because now she understood the truth. She had never been the hero of this story. She had always been the victim. Grimaldi raised one impossibly long finger and waggled it at her with theatrical disappointment. Now, Sarah, don't look so frightened. After all, the show is just beginning." He took a step toward her, and the lights in the apartment began to flicker. Another step, and the walls seemed to stretch taller, the room expanding into something that resembled a circus tent more than a living space.
A third step, and Sarah could smell sawdust and peanuts and something else, something metallic and sharp that made her stomach clench with nausea. Grimaldi spread his arms wide, his smile impossibly broader than before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to an audience that wasn't there, "welcome to Grimaldi's greatest performance." The lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into absolute darkness. In that darkness, Sarah heard the sound of her own scream finally breaking free from her paralyzed throat. And then, what happened next is a story for another night. But if you ever find a red leather book with a clown's face on the cover, remember Sarah's story. Remember that some victories are just intermissions, and some performances never truly end.